going to talk about pain sensitization in the central and peripheral nervous system briefly. So first, we have the medulla oblongata here, the brain stem, I guess the midbrain up here, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata here. That connects to the spine, or is part of the spine, kind of. Spine goes down, and so on the periphery, when you are hurt, like one of your nociceptors is triggered in the periphery, which I'll just draw like here, for example, and it goes, and there's the dorsal root ganglion, and that goes into the spine, and this is your nociceptor nerve ending here. When that pain gets conducted, it goes to a second order neuron in the gray matter, and then there it synapses and rexids 1, 2, and 5, and then from there there's a post-synapse in the gray matter, in the dorsal horn gray matter, that goes across and goes to the contralateral side and then goes up into the brain. And there's different pathways for pain. One pathway is the pathway that you immediately feel, which is mediated by your A beta and A delta fibers, which are myelinated and send that pain message very fast. Then you also have pain that you can feel that's more dull and lingering, and it's not even exactly localized, but you just feel the pain. And it's a nagging kind of feeling that's slower, that you don't feel right away. For example, like I worked at a restaurant, when I put my hand in the water and then I'd lift it back out, if it was really hot, I'd first yank away. And I yanked away because I felt the pain, and it may have even triggered my reflex to yank away. But then after even having it out, I could start to feel the worst pain, which is the nagging C fiber kind of pain. So you have two different pain pathways, and they both go into the spine from the nociceptors and the periphery. And then they synapse, and then the second order neuron in the gray matter, I guess I'll draw it here real briefly. So if this is your gray matter in the spine here, this would be your dorsal median fissure, and this would be your your ventral median fissure, and this is the dorsal median sulcus here. So you have the dorsal tract of Lesueur here that comes in. You have the ganglion here, and you have like little rootlets here. But the pathway that comes right in is called, I think, the dorsal tract of Lesueur, and that goes into the gray matter and those rexids lamina that I just talked about. And then from there, they synapse with second order neurons. So the second order neuron synapses goes across to the other side, the contralateral side, and then it ascends. And this is the gray matter. This is where your cell bodies are in this region. And you have a lot of circuitry in the dorsal, in the actual gray matter in the spine. So I say that all just to basically paraphrase how the pain pathway works. Now, I want to talk about in the periphery, there's things that happen that cause you to feel pain even more. When you first feel pain, or you first scrape something, like scrape your arm, you notice later if you try to touch it, it hurts even more, right, as it's healing. Well, that's because of pain sensitization in the periphery, and also pain sensitization that occurs in the dorsal horn of your spine. There are possibly some processes in the upper brain that also sensitize that as well. But I'm going to talk mostly about the dorsal horn and about the actual periphery here and what happens. So I need to make a large section of the dorsal horn here. So I think I'll just actually erase this real quick. Okay, so if this is a cross section of your spine here, and we amplify that a lot, and we have the area in this rectangle represent some neurons in your dorsal horn. We'd want to draw, let's see here, I'll draw your primary afferent neuron terminal right here, and this is coming from your periphery, which is from the nociceptor, which I'll draw in a little bit. And then you have your descending tracts from an area that I haven't talked about yet. Okay, let's see. So in the middle of your spine, you have the spinal canal, which I'm illustrating as a dot there. But also in your medulla, you have like the ventricular system. You have ventricle 4, and then you have like a cerebral aqueduct that goes up to the 3rd ventricle. And below that, you also have a continuation of the ventricular system that goes all the way down through your spine. That's called the central canal. Well, somewhere in your midbrain, above the spine, around that canal, which I'll just illustrate right here in the middle, even though it's a continuous tube, lumen. The area around that, somewhere in your midbrain, is an area called the periaqueductal gray matter, up here. And that region is an area that can control, has descending projections from there and from other places in the medulla oblongata. They come down and they regulate pain transmission in your gray matter. So I'm going to illustrate that by, I guess, this one. So this is kind of a regulator. And then your second order neuron, I'll illustrate as this, red. This one, I guess I'll show it curving to go up. Curves and goes up. But after it decussates, after it goes across, it does. And then this second order neuron goes up to the brain, and it can influence the 2 pathways that I talked about, depending on which one it's wired to. And it can also influence, so then out of that, then you also have what are called affective and discriminatory aspects of pain. This discriminatory aspects of pain go up to your thalamus, into the posterior lateral nuclei, posterior ventral lateral nuclei in your thalamus, and then go up to your primary somatosensory cortex and your secondary somatosensory cortex, and that's where you actually perceive the pain and can tell where it is in your body. Whereas there's other projections that go up, but they go to other parts of your brain, like that eventually go to your orbital frontal cortex, your cingulate cortex, and your insula, and like your hypothalamus, your amygdala, where you experience fear, where you detect fear, and like your parabrachial nucleus and other places in your brain. So you have the discriminative and the affective motivational aspects of pain. Now, back to the gray matter. This is the gray matter. This is your primary and your secondary pain nociception pathway, or neurons. Now I'm going to also draw the periphery here. Actually, we'll just draw it below, even though it's not necessarily in the middle of, it's not like where the spine is, but just so we have more space. Then at the periphery, you have this orange terminal here, which represents this neuron here. Okay? And then around it you have like blood vessels, which I guess I'll use red. So I'm going to draw a little capillary here real quick. And these capillaries can be made permeable to allow white blood cells through in times of inflammation. And that's why I'm actually drawing this, to illustrate that. And there's also blood vessels, like your arterioles, that this capillary is connected to. Somewhere out there, I'm going to draw one just for the heck of it, just to show it in this. So it widens have probably less permeability in your arterioles. And you have smooth muscle in your arterioles that can close, it can contract. If there's more muscular tone of the smooth muscle, it blocks blood from going through, whereas when it becomes vasodilated and relaxed, it can allow blood to go through, and there's chemical mediators that locally here that can influence that I'll talk about here in a little bit. So let's say you injure yourself and you hurt your tissue, right? When you hurt your tissue, it can release intracellular molecules like protons, ATP, because ATP is all over inside your cell and it's being used all the time. Let's see, protons, potassium, nerve growth factor, and different molecules can actually help trigger pain. There's other ones from the immune system that it would get triggered, like histamine, bradykinin, serotonin, even from like an insect bite. So I said nerve growth factor, cytokines, chemokines, prostaglandins, and other molecules that can be released by your immune system also that will trigger pain here. So when that happens and it triggers pain, you actually have the sensation of pain. It may be from that, or it could be from heat, like temperature. I said protons, any of those kinds of things that would trigger pain, like through your TRPV1 receptor. You also have bradykinin receptors, and like your ATP receptors, like P2X and P2Y, which are ionotropic and metabotropic respectively, that can also trigger pain. So just in a normal, like experiencing nociception, that signal goes up, goes into the gray matter, like this would be the, let's see here, this would be the dorsal ganglion where the cell bodies are for this orange neuron here, because it's pseudo-unipolar. Then glutamate is released across here. Let's draw glutamate as green. So you end up with glutamate coming across. Yeah, that's green. Good. Green comes across over to the postsynaptic neuron, and when it triggers that, it causes an action potential. When the sodium channels open up in this neuron, like the voltage-gated ones at least, after, say, the AMPA receptors. AMPA receptors are the main immediate excitatory receptors. They open up and allow cations like sodium into the cell, and that causes depolarization and then causes that signal. So when enough of that happens, neighboring sodium channels that are voltage dependent or that are voltage gated, when those when the potential drops, those voltage gated sodium channels open up, allowing sodium to come in, and it cascades and it keeps going through the neuron to wherever it terminates. In some cases, that's in the thalamus. So I say that all to talk about the actual action of signal transduction of the pain pathway. But so some of these molecules also, like especially the ones from the immune system, can cause sensitization and increase the likelihood of this neuron firing in response to pain. So interleukin 1 beta, other cytokines, chemokines, prostaglandin E2 especially, bradykinin, and maybe ATP and maybe adenosine, at least maybe adenosine in the spine, but adenosine also has anti-nociceptive properties. Anyway, when these molecules bind to the receptors, they cause a cascade of signals like through phospholipase A and A2 and phospholipase C that trigger like protein kinases A and C, and those can phosphorylate sodium channels that I was just talking about up here that are in this neuron, and they can cause those sodium channels to open up even easier at an even higher, or should I say lower, at an even less depolarized voltage. They'll open up and they'll allow more current through, which makes them more likely to cause depolarization and an action potential to be propagated. Also, your TRPV1 channel receptors are more likely to be sensitized. They're more likely to be triggered too, because they get phosphorylated by the signaling cascade that occurs in response to these sensitizing molecules that I talked about. So that's what happens in peripheral sensitization. But there's even more to it. Say you heat up your skin in one place, that actually can also trigger your TRPV receptor, right? And when that happens, that causes that causes excitation, and that can cause the release of mediators that augment and aggravate this process. You know how, like, if you get burnt, you're even more likely to feel pain. It's not just happening up here, which I haven't talked about yet, but it also happens here. And here, calcitonin gene-related peptide is released, and substance P is released, and those can signal your immune system cells and cause them to release more things like histamine. Not only that, but they cause vasodilation. So this part widens, so more blood can go through. And then, so like your arterioles would vasodilate, so that smooth muscle relaxes. And also, capillary permeability increases, which means these endothelial cells here start to pull away from each other to allow more white blood cells through. So when that happens, you end up with like these little granulocytes in there that can release histamine and look for bacteria, and you end up with macrophages in here. And with all this signaling, also you end up with the secretion of tumor necrosis factor alpha, and that can cause upregulation of cyclooxygenase 2 expression, which can produce, take arachidonic acid basically and turn it into something that can be converted into different prostaglandins. But prostaglandin E2 causes this process that I talked about of increased sensitization, and it's a molecule that signals the immune system as well. There's prostaglandin I2 that also gets produced out of that pathway, depending upon COX-1 or COX-2. Cyclooxygenase, COX is an abbreviation. Those can also trigger other processes via like the prostaglandin. So prostaglandin I2 also can go and vasodilate, and it's kind of anti-clotting actually as well, if I remember correctly. But anyway, that's the process that occurs in your periphery. Now, in your central part, I was telling you that there's glutamate that goes across and triggers the postsynaptic neuron and then conducts the potential. Well, this glutamate can bind to different receptors. You have the AMPA receptors, and you have the NMDA receptors that I haven't talked about yet, but they're N-methyl aspartate receptors, and those allow calcium through instead of sodium. And they're blocked usually by a magnesium ion. So I guess if I want to draw this, you have, say this is the cell membrane. You have this is your NMDA receptor, and then you have this little potassium ion blocking it. Well, when glutamate comes and binds to it, it can be activated, and it also, if the voltage drops enough, because there's enough sodium that's rushed in, if you have enough of a depolarization going on, that allows this magnesium ion to move away, because I guess it repels, or it's more likely to move away since it's not as attracted to the negative charge inside, I guess. So when that moves away, that allows your calcium ions to flow in. So calcium comes into the cell, and then it can signal processes like, it can signal a lot of things, but one of the things it can signal is calcium commodulin kinase 2, and that has different activities that sensitize the cell downstream, different things that can happen as a result of actions of calcium commodulin kinase 2, and the other signal mediators that are triggered are like phosphorylation of AMPA receptors that are inside of the cell, because you also have AMPA receptors that are in these little vesicles inside. And when AMPA gets phosphorylated and certain proteins are activated, these vesicles can come to the cell surface and fuse. The bubble fuses with the outside and allows more AMPA receptors to be put into the membrane. And when you have more AMPA receptors, you have more likelihood of depolarization from the AMPA receptors, which brings sodium in, it depolarizes the cell, and starts this process again in a kind of positive feedback loop. You also have, besides glutamate, you also have neuropeptides like calcitonin gene-related peptide that I talked about here, also comes across from here and goes there, and also can sensitize this neuron. Probably affects sodium channels there too, allowing more efficient conduction, and maybe it also closes some potassium channels so that potassium isn't leaving as readily. So when that happens, you actually have a higher likelihood of depolarization. Whereas if potassium leaves, the positive ions, if you want to think of it that way, the positive ions are leaving, then you're more likely to you're less likely to depolarize because you have the positive charge leaving, you have a more negative charge on the inside, and the electrochemical gradient basically doesn't favor depolarization as well. There's probably other effects. You also have, substance P and brain-derived neurotropic factor, and other ones that I just can't think of right now, that can go across and sensitize this neuron here and make it more likely to fire. So that's part of the reason why, when you have, if you have a burn, you can start to feel even areas around it are sensitive. That can happen because of central sensitization. It actually causes you to feel pain more easily from areas around it in your gray horn, basically. So, let's see. So I talked a little bit about central sensitization. You have your metabotropic glutamate receptors that are inside, the mGlu-R. Those are also triggered by these and can trigger slower processes of pain sensitization through cell signaling and even upregulation of some genes. So that's just like a brief summary of pain sensitization.